Located at the eastern edge of Southeast Asia is the relatively small and inconspicuous country of Vietnam. With a population of 96 million, it is the world's 15th most populous country. It is considered to be a developing nation, with a lower middle-income economy. It can, however, claim to be one of the fastest-growing markets of the 21st century, with a GDP predicted to rival developed nations by 2050. It can boast some of the world's most alluring natural landscapes, along with a rich and historic culture. For the citizens of Vietnam, modern times have been good, and living conditions have continually improved over the last decade. However, Vietnam hasn't always enjoyed such prosperous and peaceful times. It has a turbulent history, and went through prolonged warfare and hardship in the not-too-distant past. This is the story of a seemingly minor naval incident that would lead a newly designated president into a deadly power struggle between the world's leading nations and ideologies, ultimately costing the lives of almost 60,000 American servicemen. Whilst the rest of the world celebrated the end of World War II, there would be no such peace for Vietnam. Fighting for independence from French colonization, the Vietnamese would find themselves in a protracted and violent war for the next 8 years, only ending when both parties agreed to attend the Geneva Conference, temporarily dividing the country into two zones, Communist North and pro-Western South. Talks eventually stalemated, with each side proposing separate plans for unification. The North, under the leadership of Prime Minister Ho Chi Minh, proposed Vietnam be united by elections under the supervision of local commissions. It was reasoned at the time that the Communists would be likely to win these elections, thanks mostly to their superior organization and greater appeal in the countryside. The United States was committed to containing the spread of communist regimes, and so the US proposed a more palatable alternative: unification elections under the supervision of the United Nations along with support for the pro-democracy South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. Eventually, when neither of the proposals or elections took place, pro-North agents who stayed behind in South Vietnam were activated and started to fight the interim government. This internal struggle would gradually escalate into the Second Indochina War, more commonly known as the Vietnam War. Officially, the conflict was fought between North and South Vietnam, however, with the North being backed by the Soviets, China, and other communist states, and the South supported by the United States and other anti-communist allies. The conflict is widely considered to be a Cold War-era proxy war. By 1963, the North Vietnamese had sent 40,000 soldiers to fight in the South, and under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, U.S. involvement escalated to 23,000 military advisors by 1964.
As we all know, we're faced with a very difficult problem in South Vietnam, which you're all familiar with, both from the military and the political side. Men have different views about what actions we should take, and they talk to members of the press, to all of you, in Saigon, here in Washington. But I must say that
by 1963, support for Diem's policies had all but collapsed in the southern countryside, and Diem's rule had deteriorated to such an extent that with the support of the CIA and with tacit approval of the Kennedy administration, a coup would be organized, and Diem would ultimately be assassinated by several of his top generals. And just 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy would himself be assassinated.
It's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
Now the problems of Vietnam fell squarely with the U.S. presidential successor, Lyndon B. Johnson.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
Unwilling to deviate from Kennedy's approach to the conflict, Johnson vowed not to lose the war. He in fact doubled down and encouraged his closest advisors to work even harder at helping South Vietnam prosecute the counterinsurgency.
I am not prepared to risk the security, indeed the survival of this American nation, on mere hope and wishful thinking. I am convinced that by seeing this struggle through now, we are greatly reducing the chances of a much larger war, perhaps a nuclear war.
Uncertainty about his own foreign policy credentials is said to have contributed to Johnson's reliance on the advice from those close to him, such as Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, all of whom had been with Kennedy since the outset of that administration. He instructed them that victory over the Communists became the new administration's top priority. Internal U.S. politics also pressured Johnson to achieve victory. He was afraid that to lose in Vietnam would cause him to be branded as soft on communism. Having already decided to apply a greater focus and determination to the war effort, the Johnson administration recognized that direct military action would require congressional approval, especially with the upcoming election looming. The administration was still publicly ruling out American intervention, but in private Johnson was inclined to listen to the advice of McNamara, who had recently returned from visiting South Vietnam. From what he saw firsthand, he held an extremely pessimistic outlook. The situation had unquestionably been growing worse. Some 40% of the countryside was now under Viet Cong control or predominant influence. He advised Johnson, only American military intervention could save South Vietnam. Johnson knew that simply invading North Vietnam would be out of the question, and to do so may risk a Chinese intervention, as happened during the Korean War in the 1950s. Johnson also had to contend with American constitutional limits, noting under the American Constitution, only Congress had the power to declare war. While Johnson understood that congressional support was achievable, there were still some hurdles to overcome. The current Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, was known to be skeptical about using American forces to support Vietnam. Mansfield had once been one of South Vietnam's warmest supporters, but after a trip there in late 1962, came back very disillusioned by what he had seen, stating the Southern regime was just as tyrannical as the Viet Cong fighters of the North. Meanwhile, the National Security Council issued an action memorandum calling for increased military aid to South Vietnam, asserting that the country was a test case of American global leadership, and claiming that a communist victory would so damage American prestige that none of America's allies would believe any longer in the promise of American military power. By presenting the Vietnam War in these stark terms, the action memorandum lit a veritable bonfire under the congressional members. By the beginning of June, the final draft of the resolution had been completed and all that remained to do was to submit it to Congress, which if passed, would give Johnson the legal power to use force to defend any nation in Southeast Asia threatened by communist aggression or subversion. On June 15, Bundy told the National Security Council, the president did not feel Viet Cong attacks on the South Vietnamese government were a sufficient provocation for war. Johnson believed a North Vietnamese attack on American forces would be a much stronger indictment, arguing that Congress would be more likely to pass the resolution if it were presented with persuasive evidence of this happening. Also, at this stage, the majority of Americans did not even know or at the very least care about Vietnam. A direct attack on American forces would have a much greater impact on the general public. It would be the episodes that fell on the 2nd and 4th of August 1964 that would be the catalyst for increased U.S. involvement that Johnson had been waiting for. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox was engaged in a signals intelligence collection mission, known as a DeSoto Patrol, off the coast of North Vietnam. Maddox communication technicians intercepted reports of North Vietnamese vessels conducting operations in the area, possibly intent on attacking the destroyer. On board the ship, Captain John J. Herrick ordered the vessel out to sea, hoping to avoid a confrontation. But at 10:45, he reversed orders, turning the Maddox back toward the coast, this time to the north of Han Mi Island. Weather conditions were clear, and seas were calm. At 14:40, the destroyer detected 3 North Vietnamese P-4 patrol boats approaching her position. Captain Herrick ordered gun crews to open fire if the fast-approaching trio closed to within 10,000 yards of the destroyer, and indeed about 5 minutes later, gun crews followed these orders, firing 3 5-inch shots across the bow of the closest boat. Meanwhile, F-8 Crusader jets were launched from the USS Ticonderoga. 15 minutes after the Maddox had fired her initial warning shots, they attacked the retiring P-4s, claiming one was sunk and one heavily damaged. The entire encounter saw the Maddox suffer only minor damage from a single bullet from one of the P-4's heavy machine guns. The Maddox resumed her patrols, with President Johnson ordering the USS Turner Joy to join the destroyer on patrol off the North Vietnamese coast, stating that this was to visibly demonstrate American resolve and the right to navigate in international waters. In contrast to the clear conditions 2 days earlier, the weather on the 4th of August had turned. Thunderstorms and rain reduced visibility and increased wave heights to 6 feet. That night, Captain Herrick had the 2 ships move out to sea to give themselves adequate maneuver space in case of attack. At 20:40, the Maddox begun tracking unidentified vessels. Curiously, although they were more than 100 miles from the North Vietnamese coastline, the approaching vessels appeared to approach from all sides, some from the northeast and others from the southwest. The targets would continually disappear, and then appear from the opposite direction. Over the next 3 hours, fearing that they were under attack, the 2 ships would perform maneuvers, trying to evade the elusive enemy. By the time the destroyers eventually broke off their counterattack, they had fired a total of 370 shells and 5 depth charges, all at an enemy that remained conspicuously elusive. Navy Commander James Stockdale, flying a solo mission, arrived overhead at 21:35. For more than 90 minutes, he made runs parallel to the ship's course and at low altitude looking for the enemy vessels. He would later report, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats there. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." Captain Herrick also began to have doubts about the attack. As the battle continued, he realized that what they at first thought were attacking North Vietnamese could more likely be the results of overeager sonar operators and poor equipment performance. Adding to his skepticism, the Turner Joy had not detected any torpedoes during the entire encounter, and Herrick determined that the Maddox's operators were probably hearing the ship's propellers reflecting off her rudder during sharp turns. The destroyer's main gun director was never able to lock onto any targets because, as the operator surmised himself, the radar was detecting the stormy sea's wavetops. Captain Herrick sent a highest priority message to Honolulu, which was received in Washington at 13:27 on August 4th, declaring his doubts. "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Herrick's report concluded with the statement, "Entire action leaves many doubts." Back at the Pentagon, as real-time information flowed in from the Maddox and the Turner Joy, the story became more and more confused, and as frustratingly incomplete and often contradictory reports flowed in, several high-ranking military and civilian officials also became suspicious of the 4th of August incident, fueling further skepticism as to whether the attack was real or imagined. McNamara phoned Commander-in-Chief Admiral Grant Sharp at 16:08 Washington time, to talk it over and asked, was there a possibility that there had been no attack? Sharp admitted that there was a slight possibility, because of freak radar echoes, inexperienced sonar men, and no visual sightings of torpedo wakes. The admiral added that he was trying to get additional information, and recommended holding any order for a retaliatory strike against North Vietnam until we have a definite indication of what happened. It is likely that McNamara did not inform the president of Herrick's misgivings or of Admiral Sharp's recommendation for further investigation. In the face of growing uncertainties, the Johnson administration and in particular McNamara would rely heavily on a single enemy communications intercept. The National Security Agency had already broken North Vietnam's codes, and a decrypted intercept seemingly indicated that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had been damaged by American destroyers on August 4, with the enemy report stating, "Shot down 2 planes in the battle area. We sacrificed 2 comrades, but all the rest are okay." The enemy ship could also have been damaged. McNamara would pass this on to Johnson as proof positive, and amid all the other confusion and growing doubt about the attack, the enemy report was latched upon as a compelling piece of evidence adding weight to the veracity of previous reports. At 1723 in Washington, Air Force Lieutenant General David Burchinal, the director of the Joint Staff, was watching the events unfold from the National Military Command Center when he received a phone call from Sharp. He admitted that the new intelligence intercept pins it down better than anything so far. However, several intelligence analysts accused McNamara and others of misinterpreting the report. Later analysis would clearly show the intercepted communications to have been referring to the August 2 attack and the recovery of torpedo boats damaged on that day. Regardless of any conflicting information, McNamara would phone Admiral Sharp to say the president was keen to launch a retaliatory raid, but could not move unless we are damned sure what happened. Admiral Sharp in turn applied strong pressure on Herrick to rewrite his report to confirm absolutely that his patrol had just been attacked by the North Vietnamese. Just 40 minutes later, Herrick sent a message on the radio saying, certain that the original ambush was bona fide. At a meeting of the National Security Council, Rusk pressed for a bombing raid, saying the second alleged attack was more serious of the 2 incidents and that it indicated that North Vietnam wanted war with the United States. Regardless of any confusion or uncertainty, Johnson had made his decision. He commanded that the U.S. would conduct retaliatory attacks on North Vietnamese targets. Just short of midnight, Johnson interrupted national television to make an announcement.
Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight.
Back on board the USS Ticonderoga, Commander Stockdale had been ordered to prepare to launch an airstrike against the North Vietnamese. However, unlike Captain Herrick, Stockdale had no doubt about what had happened. He is reported as saying, "We were about to launch a war under false pretenses in the face of the on-scene military commander's advice to the contrary." 1 hour and 40 minutes after President Johnson's speech, aircraft launched from U.S. carriers reached North Vietnamese targets. Despite Stockdale's reservations, he dutifully followed his president's orders and led the squadron of 18 aircrafts against an oil storage facility at Vinh, located just inland of where the alleged attacks on the Maddox and Turner Joy had occurred. A further 4 torpedo boat bases were also attacked. Although the raid was successful with the oil depot completely destroyed and 33 of 35 vessels hit, 2 American aircraft were shot down, 1 pilot was killed and the second captured. Early the following day, Johnson publicly justified retaliatory measures stating,
This new act of aggression, aimed directly at our own forces, again brings home to all of us in the United States the importance of the struggle for peace and security in Southeast Asia.
It was not only the Johnson government who pushed the preferable narrative of an aggressive North Vietnam, but also various media, including Time, Life and Newsweek that would publish articles throughout August which helped reinforce this narrative. Time would also state that there was no doubt in Sharp's mind that the U.S. would now have to answer this attack, and that there was no debate or confusion within the administration regarding the incident. Johnson wasted no time, inviting 18 senators and congressmen, led by Mansfield, to the White House to inform them he had ordered a bombing raid on North Vietnam, and asked for their support for a resolution. The atmosphere of the meeting was tense, with the administration driving home the threat of an increasingly hostile enemy. Johnson would also remind those in attendance that American warplanes were already on their way to bomb North Vietnam. This made it difficult for those present to oppose the president, out of the fear of appearing unpatriotic. Most of the congressional leaders were supportive, some enthusiastically. Senator George Aiken told the president, "By the time you send it up, there won't be anything for us to do, but support you." Senator Burke B. Hickenlooper argued that there was no point in inquiring if the second incident had occurred or not, saying it was imperative that the United States must strike North Vietnam at once to show strength. Rusk told the congressional leaders, "We are trying to get across 2 points, 1, leave your neighbor alone, and 2, if you don't we will have to get busy." After the meeting, Johnson told one of his aides, Kenny O'Donnell, that he felt he was being tested by North Vietnam, with both men agreeing that how the president handled this crisis would directly impact his chance of being re-elected. Johnson felt that he must not allow the Republicans any chance to accuse him of vacillating or being an indecisive leader. The president's 2 chosen instruments for passing the resolution were the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and Senator J. William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. On the 5th of August, Fulbright arrived at the White House to meet with Johnson, who was anxious to have him support the resolution. Johnson reasoned that having Fulbright's support would bring any waivers around. The president asked his old friend to use all his influence to get the resolution passed by the widest possible margin, which would show North Vietnam that Congress was united behind his administration. Fulbright's long-standing friendship with Johnson made it difficult for him to go against the president, who cunningly exploited Fulbright's desire to have greater influence over foreign policy. Johnson insisted vehemently that the alleged attack on the destroyers had indeed taken place, and Fulbright would take Johnson at his word. However, while Johnson publicly displayed an air of confidence, privately he was already questioning the authenticity of the 4th of August attack. There was little danger of the resolution not being passed. While many senators were reluctant to vote for a bill that gave a blank check to the president, they were well aware of opinion polls showing that an overwhelming majority of Americans now supported a stronger stance in Vietnam. On August 5, 1964, Johnson submitted the resolution to Congress, and boasted it was functionally equivalent to a declaration of war, and would later joke, "It was like Grandma's nightshirt, it covered everything." After less than 9 hours of committee consideration and floor debate, the bill was passed unanimously by the House of Representatives with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution now gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to increase the U.S. military presence in Vietnam. Johnson subsequently ordered the deployment of combat units for the first time and increased troop levels to 184,000. This stronger stance saw his public approval rating rise from 42 to 72%, helping him to win the presidential election. The successful presidential campaign suggested a nation united behind its president in his Vietnam policy. With a continued buildup of forces, the U.S. and South Vietnam attempted to rely on a superiority of firepower strategy, conducting large-scale strategic bombing campaigns. Despite some progress over the next few years, the United States would find themselves fighting a war, not to win, but simply not to lose. At home, the public was losing its faith, and anti-war sentiment was on the increase. Protests that began in universities and the counterculture would eventually gain traction in the wider community.
Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 Air Medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
Come 1968, Johnson would contest a second presidential term, but with a poor initial showing and a strong contender entering the race in Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Johnson knew he had lost control of the Democratic Party. Spurred by health concerns and a growing realization that his political capital was all but spent, Johnson would go live on TV and speak to the nation announcing his intention to bow out of the presidential race.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Tragically, on June 5, 1968, and like his brother before him, Robert Kennedy would be assassinated. Republican candidate Richard Nixon would go on to win the election and inherit an increasingly unpopular war, one with an average weekly death rate of 300 American soldiers. Nixon swiftly concluded that the Vietnam War could not be won, and his administration started investigating plans for an exit strategy. The U.S. would ultimately suspend all combat activities on January 15, 1973, and 2 weeks later, with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the U.S. formally ended any direct U.S. involvement.
Tonight, I do not tell you that the war in Vietnam is the war to end wars, but I do say this. I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to that great goal, to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it. I pledge to you tonight that I shall meet this responsibility with all of the strength and wisdom I can command, in accordance with your hopes, mindful of your concerns, sustained by your prayers. Thank you and good night.
By the war's end, 58,220 American soldiers had been killed, the majority being that of young enlistees with an average age of 23, more than 150,000 had been wounded, and at least 21,000 had been permanently disabled. Vietnam would suffer a much greater toll. Some estimates would put the total deaths of all Vietnamese men, women, and children at over 2 million. On April 30, 1975, the People's Army of Vietnam troops entered the city of Saigon and quickly overcame all resistance, capturing key buildings and installations including the Independence Palace with the Viet Cong flag raised above it at 11:30 a.m. local time. After 30 years of bloody conflict, Ho Chi Minh's vision of a free and united, communist Vietnam had been realized. With the recent release of declassified documents relating to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, many contemporary historians and military analysts have concluded that the August 4th event never happened, or at least it was a far different scenario than was presented as the justification for war. Was it strictly flawed intelligence, willful ignorance, or cold-hearted political opportunism that led Johnson to make his ultimate decision? This remains a vigorously contested issue. What is not contested and is shown by records of the day, is a president all too aware that he was receiving deeply flawed information, and by the time he presented the resolution to Congress, had already determined that the August 4th incident could not be proven to have occurred by the facts at hand. Whatever the underlying motivations for participating in the war were, the end result was America being drawn into a long and bloody war, on foreign soil, fighting for a people that increasingly saw them not as their saviors but as just another foreign occupying force.